Hello, welcome everybody to the second ERSA Covid Battle on the impact of COVID-19 on tourism and mobility. I'm André Torre, I'm the president of ERSA, the European Regional Science Association, and I'm very, very happy to come back to the lecture on COVID, to this COVID battle. Of course, you know that the issue of COVID-19 is still a big concern for everybody, at least even in those last days. And this pandemic spread worldwide and in various and in different places in regions and territories and so on. But one of the major impacts on the various social and economic dimensions has been on the transport, be there in terms of mobility and the impact of travels by boat, by train, and especially by plane. And of course, this has been a very, very huge issue and is continuing today. And also, a collateral victim of this big impact has been tourism, with a huge decrease of the activity. So today we will be working on that topic. And for this session, we have invited two pretty well-known scholars to discuss about the issue of the pandemic. And it will be Özge Öner from the University of Cambridge, who will feature reviving tourism in post-COVID world, and Romão from the Yasuda Women's University of Japan, the contribution on COVID-19 meets climate change, from over-tourism to no tourism and back. The lineup is very good, of course, and we will have the exchange between these two pretty well-known scholars, and thank them to be there and to discuss. And we will proceed as follows. First, I will leave the floor to Özge in order to discuss about a proposition and then to make a presentation. Then João could reply quickly about this. Then I will let the floor to João on his turn, and then response by Özge. And after this time, we will open the floor to the discussion as usually. Of course, do not hesitate to ask your question in the Q&A, and I will, of course, pass them to the presentators, and we will open the discussion on that. So first, we start with the first presentation, and it's a presentation of Özge Öner. So Özge is an associate professor in spatial economics and real estate at the Land Economic Department of the University of Cambridge. She's also a fellow in economics at Sydney Sussex University and a research fellow at the Research Institute of Industrial Economics in Stockholm. She earned a PhD in economics in Jönköping in 2014, and now, in 2019, she was a recipient of a Young Research Award in Sweden. So she published a lot of papers and books as well, and she also writes monthly columns in the new paper of the Swedish Daily. So I think I have been quite extensive on that. And Özge, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you so much, Andre. I feel always a little humbled when I'm introduced this way, because I am going to talk about tourism, but I am not a tourism researcher. So I want to start by saying a couple of things. I'm going to waste a couple of my minutes in this, what is supposed to be a good battle between João and I don't even know whether we disagree on a number of issues, but I am good at creating conflict, so I promise that I am going to deliver a battle today. But before actually going through what I prepared for reviving tourism in the post-COVID world, I wanted to talk about why we as regional scientists in the regional science community are interested in tourism, or rather, let's flip the question around and ask, what's the difference between a regional economist or a regional scientist, somebody who is involved in regional studies to deal with questions related to tourism, than being exclusively a tourism researcher? we very recently, with two of my co-authors, one of which is here today, published a Springer book, Regional Science Perspectives on Tourism and Hospitality, which I will self-promote a little bit more later in the process also. And there we discussed the importance of regional science literature for tourism research a bit. There are a couple of things I want to highlight here that can that we can keep in mind while we are discussing COVID-19 or post-COVID-19 recovery for tourism. The first one is obviously that the geographical aggregation is extremely important. So when you look at international organizations, for example, discussing about steps and strategies for reviving tourism in the post-COVID world, you hear very little about considerations of the local economy, and the fact that in some countries actually tourism is an overpowering, over-dominating economic activity at large. But in other countries, the importance of tourism is very localized, right? So only some regions, only a few or one or two regions rely on tourism for their economic well-being. So for us, as regional scientists, we ask the right level of geography quite often. Is it a city that we are dealing with? Is it a regional network of some sort? Are we even dealing with smaller parts of a city than the city itself? And depending on what level of geography we have at hand, obviously the policy implications will be dramatically different. And
Özge, we are seeing two screens on our screen. So we are seeing you have full screen. We saw that, but we are seeing also the next slide. So your full screen is only a small part of the total screen. So
how shall I do this, I wonder?
Because it's in your browser. You have to adapt it to your. You have to, when you open. Do you have two screens? Do you have two screens at that moment?
Yes. Is this better now?
Yes. Yes. Fantastic. Thank you.
I thank you. And of course, the other method that makes regional science literature or the regional science community an important contributor to this debate is the endogeneity of production factors, right? That resources such as capital and labor, as well as institutions, the entrepreneurial capital, are determined by the very characteristics of the geography. And these things often vary quite a bit across smaller parts of a country. So that talking about these things at the national level, at the country level, may lead to rather misleading pictures. We may arrive at aggregation bias here as well. And we need to keep in mind that a tourism activity in one location is a completely different activity than the exact same activity in another location. So that the locational capital is inseparable. It's not divisible, basically, with the economic activity in question. In this case, it's tourism, since it needs to be produced and consumed at the same place. And finally, I think what makes it really important for us to keep in mind is the cumulative causation, in words of Myrdal and his followers. So success begets success, failure begets failure. The tourism industry is a very historical, path-dependent economic activity. We need to understand why we have this as a dominating economic activity in some places, but not in others, basically. Without understanding what initiates the success or the failure, basically, of tourism in one particular area, again, this is not often a country at large, except the small states. We cannot understand how the best policy can be designed for it. So here you have a screenshot of interactive overview presenting the differences in the amount of air traffic of 2020 April to 2019. This is data provided by Data Europa, basically. It's very interactive. It's not very nice to play with, to see the severity of the change that we observed almost overnight. It wasn't overnight, but in a very small period of time. And the restrictive measures taken by the European governments led to a sharp decrease of air and road traffic over this 2019-2020 period. And as it is indicated by this data, as well as by other data that is produced, which I am sure João will refer to in his speech too, the reduction of traffic is argued to be associated with improved air quality, now thanks to reduction in some pollutants, although causality was very difficult to establish. But there was very strong evidence for the probability of a causality, to say the least. And of course, this initiated a much needed and long delayed debate around the matters of sustainability in tourism in a global context. However, when we look at the situation over a longer period, covering more recent developments, for example, here you see 2019 to 2021, you see, although we are not where we were before the pandemic, the convergence is near. This strong convergence suggests that there is a push for getting back to where we were initially prior to the pandemic. This is a search I updated yesterday, right past midnight, basically. So all I have written on Google News was tourism and COVID-19, basically. Thousands and thousands of things turned up, most of which are produced rather recently. So you can see here the issue of predictability quite easier, I think. This is a very good display of how difficult it is for us to actually think about how to revive tourism in a quote-unquote post-COVID world. So I'm attacking my own title a little bit, or think about recovery, as things still change rather rapidly, right? It's very difficult for us to keep up with all the restrictions. There's very little compatibility in terms of the restrictions across different places. And we do not know, for example, what with the new variants a month from now, what the situation is going to look like. Tourism is among the industries that have been hit hardest, as Andre mentioned, by the COVID-19 crisis, probably second to health sector itself. And the tourism destinations recorded 1 billion fewer international arrivals in 2020 compared to 2019. It's not only the direct effects of restrictions and limited mobility on tourism we observed, but also there are severe indirect effects that came about. According to UN stats, for example, on average, due to linkages with upstream sectors such as agriculture, etc., a drop in tourist sales, I mean, this drop that we experienced in tourist sales led to 2.5-fold loss in real GDP. So the size of the economic loss between the 2019-2021 period alone is estimated to lie somewhere between 1.2 trillion and 3 trillion US dollars. This is an amazing number that we are dealing with. I mean, just to put things in perspective, by the way, again, according to the World Bank stats, in 2020-2021 period alone, the deep decline in international travel led to a loss of about 1.3 trillion US dollars export revenues. This is, again, to put things in perspective, this is more than 11 times the loss during the economic crisis in 2008-2009 period, during the global financial crisis. And one thing that is not highlighted enough, I believe, it should be discussed more, is that a large, roughly 100 to 120 million tourism jobs were lost. This is always a statistics that keeps coming up. But what is not highlighted enough, in my opinion, is that a very large portion of this job loss was experienced in small and medium-sized enterprises. Another statistics that you will also be familiar with is that the arrivals were down between 2020-2021 period by 80 to 90%. And obviously, the thing that is most important for us to recognize is that the effects of COVID-19 pandemic is not uniformly distributed across the globe. So every place suffered, but some suffered significantly more than the others. This is just a news piece I picked up from The Guardian. No one comes here anymore, the human costs as COVID wipes out tourism. They cover places like Nepal and Bolivia and so on, certain areas, nearly 100% of the entire economy, where nearly 100% of the economy depends on tourism, right? in part, we kept talking about the substitution between the domestic and international tourism here in this context. Some argued that, okay, the lack of international tourism could be substituted away with domestic tourism now. Countries could shift their domestic demand towards the locations, or as it's mentioned in the literature, tourism destinations available to them nearby, which can give us the possibilities to capitalize on more environmentally friendly transportation options that can lead to desirable climate outcomes in the long run, whatnot. But we have to keep in mind that for countries where tourism actually is a very important source or a very important economic base, these countries do not have much domestic tourism. They are predominantly reliant on the international tourism. Why is tourism important for many of these countries? Of course, the first importance is that both through public and private sectors in developing countries, tourism is an extremely important source of foreign currency, absence of which it has really significant destabilizing effects on the macroeconomic conditions of these countries. And none of, when we think about these countries, we think about them as very small countries, which I'll talk about in a second, but they're not all small. Even for a very large developing country, the absence of foreign currency due to a shortage in international tourism has significant destabilizing effects in their macroeconomy. And second, of course, tourism is extremely important in these economies as it provides a potential to serve as a development tool through strengthening the supply chains, right? That there are so many other industries that are indirectly dependent on tourism. And worth mentioning that in these economies, it's a very important employment base, as it is the case, by the way, in many developed countries too, but particularly in developing countries. And this is not uniformly distributed either. So when you look at actually the entry-level jobs for women, immigrants, young individuals, it serves as a stepping stone alongside some other service sectors, so that the loss of or the contraction of international tourism in these countries lead to significant effects in terms of employment, which is related to aggregate demand, and the absence of aggregate demand makes the entire economy crumble. I also wanted to talk a little bit about small state problems, which is discussed a lot in World Bank these days in relation to tourism and tourism-specific problems these countries face. With regards to problems specific for developing countries, it's important to highlight the whooping decline in tourism and how this is reflected in these small states. So, for example, just to give you an idea, more than 1/5 of World Bank members are countries with a population of less than 1.5 million. So that's roughly the kind of states we are talking about. These countries are designated some small state status, and they have access to different types of funds through international agencies than others. And they vary quite greatly in their income levels, geography, and other features. They include countries like Bhutan, Cape Verde, Gambia, and so on. There's a rather long list of places like this. And of course, one thing that is common between them is that most of these places rely again heavily on tourism for their economic prosperity, or even at this point, actually, after 2 years of contraction, for their survival. These small states grapple with common development challenges, of course, because they are domestic markets that are very small and located very far away from large international markets. So you really need to put effort into getting there and taking things out of these places if there's any production. Economic growth is extremely volatile, and financial pressures for that reason are massive. So that they have a big debt burden, which means that, for example, if you have some contraction in your tourism as a developed nation, you can maybe carry on for a longer period than a small state as such can. And that makes them, of course, far less resilient to exogenous shocks, basically. So here is a couple of slides that I will use before I start wrapping up. I start wrapping up my presentation, because here's the part that I would like to open up the discussion for what we mean by reviving tourism after COVID-19, or the steps for recovery for COVID-19. You will hear a lot of buzzwords of recovery in every report you read, in every presentation you hear, including my very own. So I am actually throwing stones at my own presentation, obviously. You will hear building back better. So we will build tourism back better. I think the things that are discussed most are sustainable, or building back better in a sustainable way, building back better in a resilient way, so sustainable tourism, resilient tourism, and they also start talking increasingly about what you call an inclusive tourism. The issue with these, and the reason why I call them buzzwords, is that there's very little discussion over what they actually mean. So when we say sustainable tourism, you look at World Bank reports, you look at OECD, you look at tourism organizations at the local and global level. Everybody talks about sustainable tourism, but nobody actually defines what they mean by sustainability in tourism. Because if we come up with actually one or few more strict explanations for what we mean by sustainable tourism, we will also have to start discussing about financing sustainability, right? In order for us to achieve sustainability, there has to be some resource allocation, and the places in which we want to achieve this sustainability do not have the financial capacity to do so. So who is going to finance the sustainability efforts, for example, in relation to tourism in developing countries and small states, is going to be an area that will have a lot of debates and discussion in the near future. And resilience, the concept of resilience. We, as regional scientists, have a better understanding of what we mean by resilience. Of course, it's roughly, and you may disagree with me, but it is roughly regions and areas' capacity to deal with exogenous shocks and their capacity to rebuild back to the levels prior to a shock. But it is not obvious when it comes to policy efforts what is meant by resilience either. And again, who is going to finance resilience is something that we will have to talk about in the context of global financial tourism. For me, the most important part is the inclusive tourism and international collaborations that is discussed a lot. So international collaborations or cooperative efforts for regulations is something that is very important. Vaccination efforts, for example, has been, I should choose my words very carefully since this is being recorded, international collaborative efforts for vaccine has been disappointing, to say the least, right? So there's very little we took into consideration around vaccine justice and beyond vaccine justice, even in places that could have access to vaccine. It wasn't obvious at all how the recognition of vaccination frameworks would work. There were a lot of friction costs and transaction costs associated with governments not recognizing each other's vaccine policies up until quite recently. And there are still some ongoing issues around that, for example. Something you would think is so easy that can be achieved at the national level, right? And with inclusive tourism, obviously, recognizing the important employment base this sector is one aspect of it, but also if you increasingly impose transaction costs on people that travel, you will create an exclusionary setup in which only those with a certain type of wealth or a permanent wealth trend can have access to tourism. So that on the one hand, talking about making tourism more inclusive, on the other hand, we need to also understand what these additional costs associated with regulations, may then be climate related or COVID related, may mean in terms of inclusivity for travel, as if you think about traveling as a basic human right. Steps for recovery. Building traveler confidence will be extremely dependent on predictability issues or other managing uncertainty. In this case, again, I believe the national governments have been very disappointing. It's almost as if the regional governments could do a better job, you feel like, but of course we don't have a counterfactual against which we can test this hypothesis, since we have experienced it in only one way. Because with coordinated efforts for travel restrictions, vaccinations, and real-time data sharing, I guess the only thing that we can say safely that worked was the real-time data sharing, and that was mostly for private, and that happened mostly because of private efforts or the efforts of individuals that are involved in data science. Financing of sustainability is something that we have to start talking about as fast as we can, I believe. It's not something that we can push further, because there are already funds, structural funds in place, both for small states and for larger developing countries, for them to quote unquote build a sustainable tourism network within their own nation, with very little to no guideline around what is meant by sustainability, really. And I think we need to start thinking about multi-level governance more. As regional scientists, we should promote the idea of, or rather, we should promote very much at least the possibility of an honest debate between centralization and decentralization, particularly with regards to managing uncertainty. Because once information is aggregated up at a larger spatial scale, you lose important bits of it in aggregation, right? So not the kind of quote you may expect to see in a presentation like this, but this kind of aggregation bias is very important for me personally in my intellectual inquiries at the very least, because in Hayek's words, the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to man how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. To the naive mind that can conceive of order only as the product of deliberate arrangement, it may seem absurd that in complex conditions, order and adaptation to the unknown can be achieved more effectively by decentralizing decisions, and that a division of authority will actually extend the possibility of overall order. Yet that decentralization actually leads to more information being taken into account. You need to listen regions. I mean, this is not a quote about regions versus nations, but I think it fits just well. We need to listen regional governments more, local governments more. We need to understand what's happening in terms of trends and response to these trends at the local level before we start actually designing policies at the national, let alone at the global level, to tackle these issues around sustainability, inclusivity, and resilience, in my opinion. Thank you so much. Also, please do take a look at our fantastic book with Oliver Fritz and Mauro Ferrante. I've seen that Oliver is among the participants. This is published in 2021 with great many contributions. It's called Regional Science Perspectives on Tourism and Hospitality. I think it's a nice book. This is the self-promotion part. And do feel free to send me an email or follow me on Twitter. I'm open for conversations. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Özge, and thank you for this very broad overview about the question of tourism and the impact of pandemic on mobility and tourism. And now I leave the floor to John for a few words and maybe a question, and then you will respond as possible.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrea, for the invitation for this battle, and also thank you for the nice presentation, Özge. Nice to meet you, by the way. I think there are a few topics that I will somehow also try to explore a bit in my talk next. One is the question of past dependence, that I think it's also a bit neglected when we speak about these issues, because there are so many different cases, so many different historical processes, that we tend to simplify a bit too much sometimes the discussions. But I will try to focus on one question, that is, you mentioned that the loss of jobs is mostly happening in small and medium companies, and that's a topic that is not tenaciously addressed. You also mentioned another important social question, that is the problems for small states, small islands that are too much depending on tourism. However, if we combine a bit these two ideas, the loss of jobs is mostly on small companies, means that the large companies didn't have too much trouble. They have strong financial structures. They can stand for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years without much problem. And there are some very large companies that are also highly dependent on tourism. For example, Lufthansa, KLM, Air France, some hotel groups, TUI Group in Germany, and these companies are not based in Cyprus or Portugal or in the Maldives. They are based in Germany, they are based in France, they are based in the United States. And my impression is that these big companies reinforce their power. The small companies have a lot of problems. These companies survived better, for sure. And whatever is the process of recovery, it will be done with these large multinational companies in a stronger position, in an even more dominant position. So what can we say? We can say buzzwords, we can say things, but in fact, the power to decide what is going to happen is in the hands of these large multinational companies. So a bit, what do you think about this? What can we, social scientists in general, how can we somehow intervene in a world that is regulated by markets and where the power of the large corporations apparently was even reinforced in this process? Okay, it's what I'd like to propose.
Thank you very much, João. So, Özge,
my quick answer, and I think this requires a very longer discussion, one that is ideally around the table rather than a Zoom screen, maybe, but and ideally not over a glass of water either. But the thing that we need to, I mean, I'm going to speak like an economist here. So when do we say government intervention is justified? Either the market fails to produce enough of a good positive externality, right? Or that the markets fail reducing some negative externality. So then we say, yes, okay, we can step in and either try to minimize this negative externality or increase this positive externality. Luckily, we did establish, I mean, as people of the world, we were pretty good at coming up with governments or different forms of governments. We have national governments, local governments, we have the European Union, we have all sorts of government-like institutional structures with some legal power over many nations, international organizations. So the institutional capacity to actually intervene is there. I think the issue here is that we do not understand externalities very well. So what you are saying is an obvious case of externalities for me. So these large companies are able to capitalize on a positive externality that is generated by a number of small actors in small places. And this positive externality is not being able to be redistributed to the very markets that take part in the production of these externalities. So it's just a matter of regulatory framework, the way I think about it. There are some countries that push for example, local representation of airline companies. I think Ireland is a good example of it. That you sometimes, with Scandinavian Airlines, you sometimes fly with SAS, the ordinary SAS, and sometimes you fly with SAS Ireland, for example, when you're taking a flight from the UK. And I mean, either the nations themselves can come up with these regulatory frameworks, or we can come up jointly as a group of nations to be able to increase these positive externalities, not necessarily stop them from being produced, but also think about how we can distribute what's being produced as a positive externality across a larger number of members. It's not I mean, I don't understand what the biggest problem here is so much, I guess. When these companies are able to capitalize on, for example, tourism activities done in small states, right? It's a question of distributive policies, like how are they taxed and at which geographical level they are taxed, and what those resources are allocated to. If that makes sense.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Özge, for the answer. Now we will turn to the presentation of João, and I will make a small presentation. So João Romão is an associate professor at the Department of International Tourism and Business the Yasuda Women's University in Japan. He's an economist also, a PhD in the University of Algarve in Portugal, and he has experienced consultancy, research, and teaching on related fields in Portugal, the Netherlands, and Japan. And João, with more than 50 publications, is pretty well known, recognized in the field of tourism and in other fields as well, like sustainable development, innovation, transportation, and territorial governance. And just to finish, I will say that he's a co-chair of the cluster on leisure, tourism, and recreation of the network of European communication and transport activities research. So, João, the floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you very much, Andre.
Yes.
Let's see if I can share this properly. Okay,
yeah,
I think it's there.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So I will. So this is the overview that it was already. I think it's already known from the website of ERSA. Basically, I will mention, or I will speak about how over-tourism was the question that we were discussing with a strong intensity before coronavirus came. We have the problems of climate change, we have problems of strong impacts in cities of the presence of too much tourists. And then suddenly we come to the opposite side where tourism suddenly disappears and we come to a certain form of no tourism and with a lot of impacts on not only economic impacts, but also social impacts and other types of effects in many places. I would like to say that this format that we don't are attached to presenting a paper is very nice. We have much more freedom, but I still have the same problem that I'm also an economist, so probably this will come a bit too much for the economic side. But anyway, I will try to speak about silence, about noise, and then I will focus more on this question of tourism and no tourism, and then a kind of conclusion with these ideas of what happens to the market regulated economies when the markets close, because it's a bit what happened. The market suddenly closed and our economy was a bit stuck in this closed market. And then finally, it came just another point. If I have time, I will mention a few things about this idea of user-generated content and big data that we praised so much. And apparently now they are, I think, very important to create this atmosphere of rejection of science, rejection of vaccines, rejection of policies, supported by contents that are produced without any kind of mediation, without any kind of evaluation in social networks. So, starting with silence, we have some diagram here from a paper that I will come back to this paper a bit later. So a very early publication, 2020, but showing a bit in the middle of January, 15 January 2020, a few countries around China registering the first cases and not much more. And then just let's say 3 months later, 31 of March, this is spread to a large part of the world in large quantities. So 2 months and a half, 3 months took to come from Asia, from China to the rest of the world. And then the impact of tourism that can be measured, for example, by the number of flights. So the question is, my first question about this silence is, what happened in these 3 months that we in Europe didn't prepare anything? Here we can have a diagram, a table that shows the reduction in the number of flights per country. And for example, Spain, in the beginning of March, the reduction in Spain was a bit more than 1% of the flights were reduced. Even 9 of March, less than 3%. And 16 of March, less than 15%. Some other countries were already with 80%, 75% in Asia. But Spain, middle of March, already almost 3 months after the first cases in China, the reduction of international flights was 13%. Then, of course, 1 week later was already 70 something. But it took so much time to react. And then we can see also how this delay was happening at the same time that Spain had the first huge wave of infections in the country. And then it came, for example, this news from the press related to Italy, but it was the same in almost all the European countries. We didn't know anything. We didn't know how to produce masks, something very simple. Apparently, we didn't know how to produce masks. The government had to say, oh, it's not so important, because they didn't have any other option. They could not say it's very important to use masks, and then there is no masks in the market. So we didn't have ventilators, we didn't prepare anything. And 3 months that happened. How is it possible that in Europe, with the knowledge, the resources that Europe has, nothing was learned from the experiences, mostly from China, but also Singapore, Korea, Japan. All the Asian countries were already implementing a lot of measures 2-3 months. And Europe was caught by surprise. I don't know exactly why. And so this is my first point of the battle. Where were we, regional scientists from Europe, when these things happened? And nobody said anything. There is by the way, I found a very interesting paper by 2 Chinese colleagues published in this journal, which name I cannot say in Dutch, although I spent almost 3 years in Amsterdam. I cannot say this name for TESG, Journal of Economic and Human Geography. And the title is very, very clear: Ignorance, Orientalism, and Xenophobia in Knowledge Production. And they make an empirical analysis of this phenomenon. And basically they say that, I'm quoting, we maintain that this binary thinking is reflective of the conflation of Orientalism, xenophobia, and state phobia in the West, which ought to intersect with sexism and racism within and outside academic sites of knowledge production. The consequence is that knowledge accumulated by experts from China, as well as other Asian countries, about the virus and mitigation strategies are marginalized, discredited, distrusted, if not dismissed altogether. And I think I had that opinion, and I'm very happy that these 2 Chinese colleagues had the work to try to show empirically that in Europe we completely ignored the knowledge that was being produced about the issue, and we faced the same problem they were facing 3 months later without any kind of preparation. Then we come to noise. We start to publish papers like crazy about coronavirus. Suddenly everybody has a lot of research, have a lot of things to do, to say about the issue. This one is a very recent review of research. So after 1 year, we can already make review articles about the coronavirus. This one is made by Mariana Sigala, very, very interesting author, and they include 177 papers published until January, only in tourism aspects. So there is many other aspects that coronavirus has impacts, transportation, whatever, else questions, of course, but only in tourism. And until January, so already almost 1 year ago, they had 177 papers. And basically they say that most studies are descriptive or theoretical, but not providing in-depth knowledge to justify their statements. And I found, by the way, some disappointing, so to say, example with some authors that I respect very much. These 2 papers are exactly from the same authors, and they were published in April 2020, so in the very beginning. And if you see the dates of submission and approval, one of them is submitted and approved in the same day, and the other has 11 days delay. So these papers were not peer-reviewed. These authors are members. One of them is member of both editorial boards. The three of them are members of one of the editorial board. And well, I would say that this doesn't help too much to build trust in the publication system, in the review system. This author-editor relation in a publication process that is clearly based on editorial decisions, no peer review involved. It's not nice, I think. And it shows not only a race that we did as researchers trying to be the first to write about this topic, but also the journals themselves trying to have the first papers. It was a strong competition suddenly. And today, exactly today, by the way, I found this paper by the same author, one of the same authors, about what he calls entrepreneurial researchers who try to manipulate information to get more citations. So that is here also. I'm quoting his own words. I suppose he's not applying these words to his own work, but well, I'm a bit surprised with all these crazy races to publish the first papers and to get more citations. Anyway, we have the at the same time also the WTO publishing a lot of reports about the situation, the travel restrictions, the reductions. For example, in May 2020, all the destinations all over the world, all the national destinations had travel restrictions, and 75% were completely closed. In June, the things started to be more relaxed. And in Europe, for example, from the destinations that opened, 37 were in Europe. So most of them were in Europe. So Europe took the lead to open the borders for international tourism when most of the Asian countries, or all of the Asian countries, were still closed. And even the largest American countries were closed. And all these, for me, seeing the things from Japan, looked a bit dangerous, so to say. And in fact, the numbers of infections climbed a lot immediately after summer. And again, I didn't see too much researchers taking positions about these questions. I saw some claims about responsible tourism, but in fact, tourism was responsible for to increase the pandemics. I think we speak a lot about the impacts of coronavirus on tourism, but I think there is also some impacts of tourism on coronavirus. And some studies, I have here two examples of studies that make an empirical analysis of how opening the borders or how the number of international flights were directly related to the number of infections. On a research note, also a similar study applied to domestic tourism concluded more or less the same. Also some relate, at least until a certain moment, domestic tourism also was directly correlated with the number of infections. A bit different type of study was done by a colleague here, Japanese, in my previous university in Japan, in Hokkaido University, Professor Saito. At a certain moment, Japan had a campaign. I think many also other countries had a campaign to support the recovery of tourism, kind of subsidizing the trips. They had to cancel the campaign at a certain moment, or probably they will reopen again, but at a certain moment it was canceled because again, it was perceived as something that was contributing to increase the spread of the disease. But a few phenomena that were observed is that this subsidy allowed mostly people with that didn't suffer so much in terms of revenues to use certain forms of accommodation, for example, in a higher level that they normally used to do. So, for example, people who would stay in a 3-star hotel starts to use a 4-star hotel. People staying in a 4-star starts to use in a 5-star hotel. So it's the same people traveling, but making a kind of upgrade in their type of accommodation. which also suggests that the recovery can be eventually easier for the highest levels, for the companies operating in the segments for highest levels of revenues. I had also some experience with this pressure for publication about coronavirus, with a paper about tourism smart specialization growth in resilience. So this paper was planned in 2016. The project was approved in 2017. The data covered the period from 2006 to 2017. So nothing about coronavirus here. But one of the referees insisted several times I should mention the paper was about coronavirus, and I should mention that in the title and this and that. So there was a huge pressure for all these things. I managed not to do that because the paper was not about coronavirus, and it's a type, I think, a type of crisis that we didn't experience before. There is in the previous crisis, we can mention the other types of virus that happened before. We can mention the Twin Towers. We can mention even the crisis of 2007, 2008. But they were relatively short in terms of the impacts, and we didn't have the destruction of productive capacity, closing hotels, closing restaurants, closing airline companies that we have now. So this puts a bit things in a different level, I think. Where I did some experiments, some analysis, so to say, of these past-dependent processes was in a book chapter written for this book, edited by two friends and colleagues from Split. And the title of the book, when they invited me, and well, when the book was published, was Mediterranean Protected Areas in the Era of Over-Tourism. So they invited me in 2019. There was this title. But meanwhile came coronavirus. So I was writing about over-tourism during the pandemic with no tourism flowing anywhere. So that's where I explored a bit the relation, because the book was published this year, speaking about over-tourism. So, but basically, I tried to, based on different types of research that I did before, I tried to explain or to show with different information data that the problems of over-tourism and no tourism happen with the same fundamental root, that is too much dependence, too much specialization in tourism. If the region or the local economy is not so much dependent on tourism, so over-tourism will not happen. If it's the same way, if tourism declines suddenly, the impacts are not so big. And this is a past dependence process. We make investments, for example, in a new airport, in a big thematic park, in infrastructures for tourism development. That has a strong impact on the future. Companies start to operate around the same sector. We have hotels, then you have the restaurant, then you have the souvenir shop, then you have the touristic guide, then you have the apps for the mobile. So we have all the knowledge of the region concentrates around one sector, and normally with a relatively low value added and relatively low incorporation of technology. So this can be many times attractive for very young people because they easily can get a job in a cafe, in a restaurant, making a reasonable amount of money, but without opportunities to develop in the future. So the question is, how much is too much? When do we understand that now we have too much tourism? Let's stop a bit. It's a difficult, also because it's a past-dependent process. Each region has different conditions. So we cannot say that 15% of the GDP is too much and 14 is not so much. It's difficult to find, but I think it's a question that we should somehow try to evaluate a bit better, is how to explore the opportunities of tourism without opening a lot of vulnerabilities, because tourism is a very vulnerable activity. We know a lot only in our life, we know a lot of negative impacts already, and this is very big. So we have to be prepared. We have to be aware that tourism is a vulnerable economic activity. So coming back to a paper by Mariana Sigala, she also made some I think interesting work about the implications for resetting the industry and also the research activities in about tourism. And she also mentions this question a bit similar to what Özge said. COVID-19 has worsened, I'm quoting, the already difficult situation faced by an increasing number of tourism micro entrepreneurs, food delivery people, Uber taxi drivers, Airbnb hoteliers, because these people have informal work, very precarious work, very high flexibility, often very low salaries. So this was the most vulnerable people, and often not even entitled to receive support and to receive subsidies because they work in so informal ways. So in a similar way, we had also all the people working in culture and so-called creative activities that depend on performances, on public performances, and it's not only the singer or the actor, it's also the persons taking care of the lights and the sound engineer. It's a lot of people, and in Portugal, that I know a bit better, people were organizing networks to provide food for some of them who could not afford to eat after some time without work. And this also happened in Europe. So there was a strong shock in some sectors, some parts of the population, including these creative sectors that we normally claim that are so important for innovation and for the future of our world. There are also some different types of analysis or statistics or data explaining how many people came back to poverty or fall in poverty for the first time during the pandemics, and at the same time how much billionaires increased their wealth during this process. So this is a bit to frame the question that I would like to raise, that we have an economy that is regulated by markets, and suddenly the market closes. We cannot go to the market. The shops have to close. The workers cannot go to work. The salaries are not paid, etc. So what happens in that case? How do we manage this situation, or the situation of all these people involved? Is it the case that an economy very much supported by a strong state like China is better prepared to deal with this? Maybe the government of China can just say, okay, everybody stays 2 months at home, nobody has to pay the rent, and we ensure that everybody will receive food. Is this good? Is this not so good? I didn't see any discussion about this. It seems that we cannot discuss this kind of thing. I'm not saying that this is the best solution, but I'm saying that even in situations where our market regulation, it's not that it doesn't work, it just disappeared, it's not there. We don't discuss other options to organize our economy, to organize our production, to organize our resources. And I felt that I think we could also make some effort on this. Is there some different ways to organize that are not exclusively market oriented? So finally, a bit of words about what can be the tourism after this. So I would say that from my perception, not exactly from my scientific analysis, tourism after Corona, I think the pressure for economic recovery will make us forget all the things we are discussing about climate change and all these questions of the return to large-scale operations, and mass tourism will be very strong again as soon as possible. Tourists with higher revenues, or at least those who were not impacted, like us, professors and this kind of thing, were not impacted by the crisis, will lead the recovery in terms of demand. and establishments linked to large international companies or oriented to the top segments will recover the supply. Increasing social inequalities that we observed during the pandemic will be reflected in tourism, I think, and I think it will lead to what Özge was mentioning as something that we would need to avoid, that is, let's say, the recovery for the rich. Social inclusion is also important when we speak about sustainable development. It's not only economic issues, it's not only protecting the environment, it's creating an inclusive society. And I'm afraid all this process will make tourism less inclusive and less democratic than it was before. Also, I would say that at least in the beginning, people will tend to travel less and maybe make a bit longer trips because the risks are maybe smaller. Eventually, I spoke too much. If I have a few more minutes, I can say a few things about big data and things. Just to say that, well,
I think we have to continue the discussion. Yeah.
Can I say 1 minute or two or not?
No, I think it will probably better to go to a question by Özge.
Okay, I keep for okay. So that's all. I'm waiting for the comments.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, João, for raised so many controversial issues, I would say. So that's very nice. And then Özge, you can ask the question, please, or make your remarks.
Yeah, this is the battle part, and I think it's a very, very nice presentation, João. Thank you. It was very informative. Particularly rush to publication part is very interesting, actually. The fact that you stumbled on something so remarkable, and I'm sure it's not the only example of such outcome either.
I'm afraid it's not.
So I understand that you were making a conservative representation of the situation. I mean, I have to challenge you on one thing. Yesterday I've been going through the literature once again, and the reports of World Bank and OECD and so on, sort of trying to see if it is I who misses the definition of what we mean by sustainable tourism. When we say a sustainable development in tourism, what do we mean by it? What is? I mean, I understand that there can't be a single definition, but in your domain, in your world, what is sustainable tourism?
Okay, João, you can respond. For the other person, you can start to put your question in the Q&A and the discussion. There are already a few ones, but we can continue on that. So please, João.
Well, I would say that eventually we can agree theoretically there is a lot of work by the WTO with the SDGs, what tourism can do for each of them and this and that. I would say that in practical terms, the economic dimension, there is always a lot of people worried about how to keep the jobs, how to create more jobs, how to keep the economy working, the companies working, etc. No question about that. Then about the environment, I think sometimes eventually there is some greenwashing, but I think in many occasions there is a real concern about finding I mean, also to save. I think hotels tend to spend a lot of resources, waste a lot of resources that it's almost uncontrollable. We have much more showers. We use the air conditioning, whatever we want. We go away. We don't close it. Sometimes we don't even know how to work with the device of the air conditioning. We do everything wrong. There is a lot of waste with the food is incredible. When it's buffet systems, it's incredible the waste of food that we make every day. and it's almost impossible also for us to avoid to do it better. But of course, the hotels now they try to do better. They have automatic systems to close all the lights when we leave, to close the air conditioning. So there is an improvement to save water, to ask us not to put the towels to wash every day, this kind of thing. Also, many destinations, I think, are making effort in terms of transportation and this kind of issue. However, there are two issues that I think we are just ignoring. One is the question of international tourism, basically in air flight, transport by air. We can make international tourism in Europe with trains, but if we are speaking about in Asia, it's so big countries, or between continents, it's with airplanes, and we don't discuss too much if we really need to stop this or not. And then there is the next question: do we stop this, and then market decides? That means so only rich people can travel, and that's the social question, or the question of inclusion, that I think it's totally absent of the discussions about sustainable development, in my opinion, or in my perception at least, or at least it's very marginal, the type of discussion about this. And mostly now, I think the situation of economic crisis, unemployment, companies closing, and this and that, makes a huge pressure to not to speak too much about social inclusion and about environment in the next few years, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we start with the questions, and then I will ask you the question, and then you respond both if you want. So there is a first question by Nelly Georgieva in the Q&R, and it's the question is: do you see COVID-19 as a possible trigger of rethinking the driving role of tourism in some economies and need of diversifying the economic base in these places? So that's a big question, but maybe Özge, you can start.
I had actually a few slides, and then I timed myself before the presentation, and I realized I had to cut them off. So thank you so much, Nili Georgieva, for the question. So I get to talk about it a little bit. But the context of concept of resilience, for example, as opposed to sustainability, is something that makes more sense to me. I guess that's, again, the economist's brain, because I understand what we mean by it. It's easier to measure it, and also we can see what it correlates with, even though we may not be able to establish a causal link. And we do know that diversification of industrial structure at the local level may actually make these areas more resilient. The issue with tourism, though, and that's why I mentioned the path dependence quite a lot, we need to understand why a particular region wasn't diversified to begin with, right? I mean, tourism activity is as exogenous as it may seem, because it's often reliant on first nature geographical features of a place, right? That if you have nice mountains, you have good skiing, and if you have a good coastal area, it's a nice summer destination, whatnot. But for every successful tourism destination that rests on first nature geography, there exists maybe 5 with same or similar features that did not develop in their tourism industry to the same extent. So before we think about concepts of smart specialization and further diversification, which I too believe are important covariates of resilience, as I said, it's very difficult to establish a causal relationship, but that we know that they correlate quite a lot, diversification. But before we jump at it and say, okay, so now let's diversify this region and its economic structure, or let's look at smart specialization policies, we need to understand essentially why tourism plays such an important role through an historical lens to begin with. I think we're getting a little bit, we rely on our capacity to design an industrial composition in an area sometimes a little too much, at least in the narrative, so to say. Otherwise, it's very important. Definitely, there's going to be a shift towards a more diversified industrial structure. We already see it not only in tourism, but I mean, here in Cambridge, for example, there are huge staff shortages with regards to kitchen staff. And everybody keeps raising the wage, and still we cannot find people to work. I mean, we cannot man up the kitchens of the colleges these days, for example, and it's a citywide problem, because when people were exposed to this huge shock over such a long period of time, they changed sectors, and it created a historical discontinuity of some sort, that not all of them came back to the initial jobs that they had. Some of them stayed with the new jobs that they found, particularly in warehouses and logistics related businesses. And now we all of a sudden have this huge staff shortage that will lead to some structural changes that will persist, obviously. Not everything will go back to normal, for sure. And these kinds of things will happen, I think, at the aggregate level too. And by aggregate, I mean the city and the region and so on. I see Oliver is writing something.
Yeah, Özge, but John, maybe John, you want to respond to this question as well. So you have to put your mic.
I will show again one of the slides that I think was a bit fast. Am I showing something? Oh,
Yeah.
So it's from this book chapter. Let's say that I think it should be a trigger for rethinking the driving role of tourism. How much it will be a trigger or not, I think it depends on the initiative of local authorities, I think, and the companies operating. But I would say that balancing a bit the development, supporting the development of clusters of activities not related to tourism is important, and it's sometimes difficult in regions that have a strong touristic activity, because the funds to support investment are limited, and if they invest in tourism, they know that there is some return. If they invest in something different, they are not sure. So there is a strong tendency for the policymakers to, because they also have to show results and try to be elected again and try to please the people. So the pressure to invest in something that is already working is normally very big. And my region, Algarve, where I did my PhD, is a very peculiar case of this. This discussion exists since the 80s. Should we invest in tourism because we know it works? Or should we invest in something else because tourism doesn't need any support, they work by themselves, so should we invest in other things? But then the other things fail or whatever. So this discussion keeps forever. But I think the vulnerability of tourism is so strong that we really need to find some balance in which there are other groups of activities that can also have a relevant contribution. Then tourism itself can have a much stronger connection with other local activities, since agriculture, the local food, ICTs, more technologies to manage environmental questions, to apps to show the local cultural heritage, apps to make bookings and to move in the places. So all the creative industries. So there is a lot of potential of tourism to interact with different sectors, transportation, energy production and consumption, to interact with sectors that are not so weak in terms of incorporation of technology. So I think we can make an effort also, in one side, to develop sectors that are not so much reliant on tourism, and at the same time to make an effort to connect tourism with sectors that help to integrate more knowledge and more technology in the system. Because technology, it's not only the machines themselves, it's also the young people who makes PhDs. They cannot go all to the university because also demographic reasons, and it's impossible that universities can accommodate all the young people, very talented everywhere, doing PhDs and doing very good research. So we need an economy that also mobilizes these young researchers. And in many cases, tourism is not helping. And I think there is some potential to do it better. Okay.
There is an interesting remark of Leila Kebir in the discussion, because I have to manage both. And the remark is about the question of a kind of over-tourism during the pandemic, because more or less you address the idea that there have been over-tourism maybe before, but during the pandemics and even now there's a huge reduction. But it is also clear that especially last summer, there were a huge number of people coming to tourist areas, and sometimes very crowded. And the question is, there have been big congestion issues in so-called natural areas, mountains, for example, since COVID lockdowns. And so a lot of people can address this issue. So I would like you to respond this both in general terms over this idea that in a way, there have been also another frequentation of some places, even during the pandemic era. So maybe, John, you can start this time.
I think my perception, at least, because personally, I moved to this city where I am 2 years ago, already during the pandemic. So I don't know anything around. I didn't know anything around. I didn't know even the place where I'm living. But I had the opportunity to travel a lot. There is lots of small islands around Hiroshima, many places in rural areas. And in fact, it was very nice to do this kind of tourism, avoiding the concentration of people in the cities. This can happen, in fact. But I'm not sure how much this is just temporary, because we cannot travel. Should we do this online if before coronavirus? We were not doing this kind of event online before coronavirus. We were meeting in the congresses, eventually with some special session or this or that, but we were not doing this. Will we continue doing this after? Probably yes. I'm not sure. I tend to prefer meetings in place, but of course I have to understand that keep traveling like we were traveling is not very realistic or sustainable. And I think we should use also our learning how to discuss and how to share ideas in these platforms as a good way to reduce business travels. So I would tend to agree with Leila that probably we will travel less for business and more for nature. I would say so. That's what I'm doing, but I'm not sure if everybody was.
Okay, thank you, Özge. What's your point of view? Because, for example, last year in France, not last year, this summer, it has been quite obvious that there have been a real overcrowding of people in several natural areas, especially in the mountains and in the rural areas, because a lot of French people only went on holidays in France and they overcrowded those places. And in a way, it has been also quite difficult regarding to a kind of inner tourism.
I think that question is very much linked to also what Oliver mentioned in the question and answer screen, like what's the long-term consequences of fewer business trips. And somebody else also mentioned the proximity tourism, so traveling to places that are nearby, for example, all of these things, and overuse of or over tourism in natural reserves and natural areas. All of these things are pretty much linked to one another, because it's opportunity cost after all. For every travel we don't get to do for a business related activity, maybe we prefer to take a shorter trip somewhere within the country, or somewhere within a nearby country by car or by a train, whatnot. And often these places offer us amenities that are not the type of urban amenities or tourism amenities that we find in densely populated areas, but it's that we are after natural amenities. And the infrastructure around natural amenities are not designed for the kind of demand that these places experienced over this period, which obviously leads to, once again, sustainability related questions. So when we are praising domestic tourism over international tourism because there are fewer flights now, we're being a little bit too optimistic about what it may mean for the preservation of what is available within these countries, I believe. So it's a very important point. I think it's a very important point to take into account. We can't just do an accounting, a cost accounting type of thing where we look at, okay, so there were this many flights before and there are now fewer flights and hence we are in a better situation. But people do have need for leisure consumption, and they will shift their alternative or they will shift to other alternatives available to them. We need to understand what those alternatives are and what the consequences of alternative modes of consumption in the context of tourism may look like in the short, but as well as in the long run. Can I very, very quickly respond to João's, it's like the sustainability bit? I'm very pleased to hear that you are, I mean, you have this rather, you know, structured idea around what you consider to be sustainability. And I believe you may agree that that's not always the case when you hear the term sustainability, that it captures everything and anything in some documents sometimes, that it's praised for 5 pages and you have no idea what it is that they are going to do in relation to sustainability. And I understand that because I often see that in the same document, the sustainability goals and inclusivity goals are praised simultaneously, while I believe there's a trade-off between the two of them. They're not entirely mutually exclusive, really. So that's, I don't want to be misunderstood there, that you can still seek for some inclusivity in terms of access to travel or in relation to job losses that may be experienced in countries where tourism is the predominant activity, but you will have to give up some of it at the very least if you are going for the sustainable development policies that are at least being discussed in today's debate. And I understand that this may be uncomfortable for people, but we have to be intellectually honest and recognize that there exists a trade-off. So that's it.
But what do you think of the what do you think of the idea that in a way this kind of proximity tourism could be very unsustainable, because at this time we are used, a lot of tourists are used to go to places, very crowded areas, which are almost destroyed. If I can say something, for example, if you go to the French Riviera, everything is artificialized, so there is no more nature. So in a way, okay, if you put more people, it's not so important. And if you direct these flows towards new places, which used to be quite protected and quite natural, it could mean also that tourism could start to destroy as well those places. And in the end, it could become quite unsustainable as well, and to increase the unsustainability of tourism.
Can I add something about?
Yeah. Okay,
so I think there are some suggestions in the Q&A about proximity, the idea of tourism of proximity. That, in my perception, this would be a proper answer to the question of climate change. Instead of getting airplanes and go to the other side of the world, we just get the train and go somewhere close by, and then another place. There are so many places that we don't know. We really don't really need to travel all the time to the other side of the world. So proximity tourism would be a nice answer, I think, a nice perspective in terms of facing the questions of climate change and energy consumption and these kind of things. What I'm afraid is that COVID will have a bit the opposite impact, because, for example, cities, that is where the concentration is now more obvious, the hotels are there, the low-cost companies are operating, they have the airplanes, they have the places allocated in the airports, they have everything ready to start again to operate. And they will start as soon as possible with their very powerful campaigns, very cheap flights, very cheap hotels, very cheap packages, and put everybody again to do the same things. even if we are here saying, no, this is not the best thing to do, we should, and we can do by ourselves if we want. But in fact, maybe if Özge invites me to give a talk in Cambridge, I get the plane and I go. Of course, I don't go. I don't go. I don't go here to the university.
Likewise, João. I look forward to meeting.
As soon as possible, we start to fly as much as we can.
Likewise.
I'm afraid. So let's say theoretically, I think the idea of proximity is very good. And I think we don't have how to escape in the long term to that kind of approach. But each individual person always likes the idea of getting a plane and going somewhere else. And mostly the companies that are installed that make investments, they have all the planes, they have all the hotels empty, they need to restart as soon as possible, and they will make big pressure to restart as soon as possible. So I'm not sure how we can manage these, how the states even can regulate this, because as I said in the beginning, the pressure for economic recovery will be probably much stronger than other type of concerns. I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I think we are close to the end, and then Özge, I let you the last opportunity to say something and to conclude about our webinar, because it's already 3 p.m. and 30. So, Özge, please.
Thank you, Andre. I don't want to repeat myself so much. I mean, I wish actually we can have this conversation in person and longer, ideally, João, at one point with other friends too that joined us today. And thank you all of them actually. There's not one answer to any of these rather complex questions. Is the cliche answer I have. But I think essentially it's very important to recognize the trade-offs again. Domestic tourism can never be a perfect substitute for international tourism, particularly for developing countries and small states, which is something that we may be okay with, but then we have to accept the fact that there's a trade-off there, for example, for climate purposes. And the same goes for sustainable tourism goals that I see sometimes here and there versus the inclusivity arguments there, that you can't keep the cake and eat it. So that as long as we recognize these trade-offs, I think we can have a healthier and more practical discussions around what can be done. That being said, I don't want to paint a grim picture either, that I don't want to be the Grinch that stole the Christmas during this holiday season that's about to begin. So I believe in human capacity to build better institutional structures to distribute, both maximize and distribute better the positive externalities produced by people, as well as minimize the negative externalities that are produced by people. I think carbon trading schemes and similar ideas are a good example of it. And perhaps we will see more practical solutions rather than conceptual discussions pretty soon, or fingers crossed, let's say. Thank you so much for also inviting me. This was really fun. And I'm looking forward to meeting people in person too. And I'll do that the first opportunity I get to do that, definitely.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much for both of all. So I think that, of course, it's pretty obvious that domestic tourism cannot be a perfect substitute for long-term tourism. For example, in Paris, we lost a lot of people, and domestic tourism is not an issue in any sense. So we lost most of the very rich Chinese people. So there's a huge decrease in GDP locally. And of course, this is pretty non-sustainable, but in the end, it's a big economic issue as well. So thank you very much, Özge. Thank you very much, João, to have been there, to have contributed, and for your exchanging. And thank you everybody for all the attendees to be there, and see you and for your questions. And see you next time for the next ERSA Covid battle. So bye-bye. Have a nice day.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Bye.